Hello, Willowbrook family. Today's daily Devo is found in Luke chapter 6. I'm all comfortable sitting next to my hot water heater. A portion of the water that comes into my house is set aside into this tank where it is heated up and ready when I need it. I can take a hot shower or wash dishes or just wash my hands. I'm sure glad hot water heaters set aside some water so I don't have to take a cold shower every day. That is a very good reason to have this. In Luke chapter 6, we see what happens when Jesus sets aside some things for a good reason. This chapter opens with the Pharisees complaining that the disciples are breaking the Sabbath. As they were passing through some grain fields, they were picking the heads of the grain and rubbing them with their hands and eating the grain. Well, the Pharisees had a fit over this. They called it work, and you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. In fact, the disciples broke the Sabbath law 4 times. 1, they picked the grain. 2, they rubbed the heads together. 3, they blew the chaff away. And 4, thus preparing a meal. Jesus reminds the Pharisees that he is Lord of the Sabbath. In fact, in Mark, Jesus says that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. Now later on another Sabbath, Jesus proves this by doing a good thing and healing a man with a withered hand. Oh, the Pharisees were furious and they lost their minds. They had turned the Sabbath into something that it was never meant to be by adding this long list of do's and don'ts, mainly don'ts. The Jewish leaders had added over 600 laws to the original intent from God, and they turned it into something very different. God had set aside one day a week to focus on really worshiping him and resting in him, setting aside something for a good reason. Now, this theme continues in the next section. Jesus had a large number of followers or disciples, a whole lot more than 12. So he retreats to the mountain to spend time with his Father and to pray about who he will set aside from the larger group to finish forming up the group of 12. He prayed over each name and chose the remaining men who would form the 12 disciples. And he would pour himself into them, setting aside something for a good reason. Now, not only did he call them disciples, but he called them apostles, which meant the sent ones. Now, they had no idea how their lives would change. Jesus would indeed use them in a great way. Well, as soon as they were all finally together, there was so much truth that they needed to know. And Jesus would spend the next 3 years teaching them. But today, the 12 assembled together for the first time. Jesus set aside some important truths that he wanted them to know up front. Now, as you read this sermon, it sounds a lot like the Sermon on the Mount, found in Matthew 5. Some scholars believe this was the Sermon on the Mount, and others, they would say it's the Sermon on the Plain. It's essentially the same sermon, but given at a different time and place. Jesus went through the countryside, preaching and teaching, and we would call that being an itinerant preacher. So it really wouldn't surprise me if he repeated this sermon in many places because so many people needed to hear it, and it was so important. Now, notice all the details in this sermon. This is where Jesus wants us to focus our daily living. Jesus is saying, if you want to be pleasing to God, focus on these things, not the 613 laws made up by man to impress man. Don't serve God to impress men. Jesus wants the disciples to know that to please God, you first need to admit that you have nothing on your own and you need to be hungry for God. And he will reveal himself to you because he alone provides everything. So if you're going to start serving God, this sermon is a great launching point. I'm so glad that Jesus set aside these truths to teach the disciples and to teach us. It's a great attitude to start every day. And thank you for setting aside some of your day for God's Word. Have a great day in the Lord, Willowbrook.